Arvo, is this where the supplies are? Where the food is? Clementine asked, though she seriously doubted. It just took one look at where the Russian had led them, to a power substation surrounded by a fence. It was obvious that it wasn't what Arvo had in mind when he mentioned a food-stocked place. Frowning, Clementine repeated her question. Then he was silent, prompting Kenny to give him a shove. Answer her, goddammit! The teen stumbled a bit, flinching at the stiffness of his leg, and eventually shook his head. No, is more walk. Few hours. Kenny roared in frustration, the gun still pointed in Arvo's direction as he shook his head and gnashed at his teeth, his one hand ironically holding AJ's cradled form as gently as possible. The weapon had constantly trained on Arvo was getting on Clementine's last nerve. Why did Kenny insist on treating him like he was going to attack them at any moment? He had shot down his own sister before she could turn, but that was all enough to destroy anyone psychologically, at least for a while. The fact that Arvo had initiated the fight didn't help things either. He couldn't be at a good place, mentally. Not like any of them were, though. Clementine then stared down at the hill towards the substation, noting that the area was covered by fence on all sides. That could mean safety for at least the next few hours. Everyone seemed tired, but it was worth to risk the stop and rest. She blinked and exchanged a glance with the same person standing next to her, who happened to be Sarah. Do you think that's safe enough to stay the night? The older girl asked, chewing her lip as she voiced Clementine's thoughts. Don't see why not, Mike replied. He turned then to face Kenny. I mean, it's surrounded. We could sleep in shifts, just like how we did back at Parker's Run. It'd be nice to get some actual rest again. Kenny swept his eye over the group, promptly taking on how exhausted his companions were, and then his sight fell on AJ. The baby was sleeping peacefully, cradled in a blanket, and kept snug against Kenny's chest for warmth. But there was no way that he would last if they kept going until nightfall. They couldn't get him food just yet. The fire would keep the infant alive. Eventually, after a brief moment of the thought, the older man nodded. Fine, he huffed, trudging through the snow and shouldering past Arvo. We gotta get a fire going and figure out the shifts as quickly as possible. Though it's almost sundown and I ain't no freezing to death. Clementine felt a rush of relief at the answer, seeing the same expression on the faces of the rest of the group, and followed Kenny down the hill. She heard the infant footsteps of the others following her, silently creating a deep path of prints in the snow. I hope we can at least have one quiet, peaceful night, she thought, though that didn't seem likely. The sun was beginning to set. Clementine focused her gaze on the orange splashes along the horizon. Nodding away at the barren trees seemed to have blended in the warm colors of the sky was producing. She let out a small sigh, seeing her breath leaving in a puff of visible frozen air. Huddling into herself, she gazed around the group seated around her. Everyone had such a tired, defeated look upon their faces. She couldn't even look at everyone for too long. If she could catch their visible despair like some sort of disease, or like plague, reanimated the corpses after death. Clementine felt another shudder came course through her and scooted towards their fire, which was a little more than a small, pathetic flame, bundled in the bristles and twigs. The members of the groups are smart enough to sit by only the source of warmth. Bonnie, Mike, Nick, Sarah, Luke, and Kenny soon followed Clementine, getting close enough to feel the heat radiating into their faces. Jane and Troy, on the other hand, though, for whatever reason, those particular members of the group thought they were all somehow above warmth, or they were just too prideful to join everyone else. But she supposed it didn't matter. Like saying it went, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And those two horses were more stubborn than anyone Clementine have ever encountered so far. Oh well, they're lost, she thought in return, turning her head to look at the two adults, who had their backs turned against the group. They weren't near each other, per se, but they did reside at the same general area. Troy was sitting a ways away off from Jane, picking at the ground with his hand. Jane had her arms crossed, brooding about who knew the what. Sarah, on the other hand, her shoulders snapped Clementine back into reality. Turning to the older girl, she flashed a grin and smile her way. How are you doing, Sarah? She asked. The thought of retrospect, it was a stupid decision. None of them were doing well, so the only one answer that. Still, her friend gave a shrug and replied, I'm okay, for now at least. I kind of feel sorry for Arvo, though. She cast a glance over at the Russian teen, who was bound by his hands all over the corner of their campsite. His head hung low, quiet sobs making his shoulders shake. A soft, sympathetic look crossed Sarah's face as she whispered, Sarita wouldn't have liked this. Clementine had to agree that Kenny's rage at the boy was misguided, but as he was more angry at the death of someone who beloved him than anything. Still, Arvo was his chosen punching bag, and she could do little to stop the abuse. Arvo provoked the fight, but ultimately he didn't hurt anyone. She sighed, curling her knees up to her chest and mumbling, I feel bad too. He just put down his old sister for once. Clementine was glad that she was the only child, and she couldn't imagine having to shoot someone else close to her age that had been around for most, if not all, of her life. In fact, the chilling thought made her shudder. Kenny, luckily, didn't hear the conversation and was gazing down warmly towards AJ. The baby was asleep, evident by the lack of cooing from his bundle, and it seemed peaceful for now. In fact, everyone seemed to be calming down a bit after their hellish day. They needed it. After the lives they had just lost hours ago, a mental break was definitely necessary. Clementine tried to put on a smile for the group, tried to break herself from the harsh reality to just enjoy the peacefulness, even if it was an illusion. Maybe if she tried hard enough, she could trick herself into believing everything was okay. That was rather amusing thought, as nothing up to this point had worked in her favor. A rather hopeless grin spread across her cheeks. Instead, but she quickly buried it underneath the frown. She could not just let this world break her. It wasn't an option. She wouldn't have given herself to the luxury of becoming bitter. Luke's voice then drowned out the fruitless of the attempt of cheering up, thankfully distracting her from her thoughts. His face looked rather distant as he announced, Today's, my birthday. At least I assume it's around this day, yeah. Blinking, Clementine felt a natural smile come across her cheeks and replied, Happy birthday, Luke. She remembered all the birthday parties that she had went to as a kid. Days of piñatas, ice cream cakes, seemed so far away now. What she couldn't give for was a chocolate chip cookie. Yeah, happy birthday, man, Mike echoed. For the rest of the group, followed by similar wishes. How old are you? 27. Sure, he felt hell of a lot older, though, Luke replied sheepishly, running a hand through his hair. Nick elbowed him. You're already only a year older than me, dude. Don't make me feel old. Come on, you two don't start with that shit. Kenny chuckled, shaking his head with a smirk. Luke only gave a half-hearted smile in return. I got out of college 5 years ago. It feels like a million of years. His face then fell upon trailing off to stare at the ground. Clementine couldn't help but notice that forlorn he looked, despite the light-headed topic. At least I don't have to worry about paying off the student loans. I hear that, Mike chimed in. I'm sure there's some asshole sitting on that paperwork waiting to collect. I'm lucky I went to a state school. Wasn't as much cash to dish out. What did you study? Clementine asked. Alice glanced at both Mike and Luke. She had heard of the dreaded student loans, but thankfully didn't have to deal with them before the apocalypse. Two exchanged glances, and Mike answered first. Pre-med, like I said, state school not meant for much for institution, but it was for the first part of school. I still had to work my ass off. I was heading for more schooling before all this shit. Luke then raised his eyebrows, clearly impressed. Damn, and here I was just getting a degree in art history, with a minor horticulture to keep my old man happy. That sounds cool, Sarah commented. Kenny snickered. Stared at this. Sounds like you two majored in working in a coffee shop. Pretty much, Luke admitted, exchanging a smirk with Bonnie. Said redheaded seemed to get up with all of a sudden, reaching down in her knapsack and mumbling to herself, eventually bringing up a large bottle. Oh, and I almost forgot. I was saving this for a special occasion, and well, it being your birthday and all, figure as it's good as time as any. As she was moved it about, the thick liquid inside the bottle sloshed around. Clementine had seen that sort of thing before. It was some kind of alcohol, but with a bit of a sly smile. Oh, would Lee think of her now? She said, I would like to sip, after you, obviously. Nick gave her a sheepish look. Really? The last time she had a sip of something like that was in the shed with him, and they both remembered how badly that had gone. Absolutely not, Kenny snapped, flashing a glare towards her. You're not drinking. That is that. Sarah scrunched up her face. Yuck, Kenny's right. We're not supposed to drink that yet, Clem. Where did you get that, Bonnie? A rough, unexpected voice sounded from near over. She frickin' stole it from Bill. How else do you know it? Troy had turned around. His eyes narrowed fiercely. The dark spot that he was in only made him more menacing, though Clementine could see right through his bullshit. Oh, Bill didn't like to drink anyway, Troy, Bonnie responded. What was the harm in taking it? Well, y'all won't be getting help from me if you're too drunk to defend yourselves. Irresponsible assholes. The man trailed off into the grumbles, and he just turned her back around, no doubt glaring towards the fence. Clementine then sighed to herself, rolling her eyes as she almost forgotten how annoying he was, the piece of the situation. But he had just had to remind her. Luke then chuckled at the irritated look, gazing down at the bottle that she'd been given. Well, anyway, I feel a little guilty taking the first. Whoa, wait. You gotta make a toast first, Bonnie insisted. Come on, birthday boy. You don't have to be fancy. We'll just pass the bottle around afterwards and have a sip. Luke took another slow at the group, eyes focusing on each member of the group before he cleared his throat. His voice trembled a bit as he lifted up the drink and choking out, to the loved ones we've lost along the way, and to hope that we see them again someday. Clementine frowned, watching everyone's faces melt into pensive thought, each person reflecting on their own lost friends and family. Just for a moment, she found herself thinking of Lee, her parents, of Sandra, of everyone that she had met to say goodbye to since the whole thing began. Closing her eyes, she pretended Lee was next to her again, and tried to convince herself that the warmth of the fire of his hand gently rubbing her back. The illusion was so strong that she swore she heard the word sweet pea for a moment. But of course, when she opened her eyes again, Lee was gone, and the fantasy died away, just like him. The next moment, however, Sarah's hand squeezed hers. She gazed over at her friend. The girl's eyes were tearful, but she was clearly trying to stay strong despite that. Clementine forced a smile of her friend's sake, turning her attention back to the adults. Here, Mike chimed, raising his hand. That was nice, man, Nick commented. Luke smirked. Yeah, I didn't mean it for it to rhyme, just sorta did. He then pressed his bottles to his lips, taking a long sip of the drink. Pulling back, he wiped his mouth off with a rough sigh, handing it over to Bonnie. Thanks, she murmured, her sigh set on the two members of the group, refusing to get warm. Hey, Jane, Troy, you all want a sip of this? For the toast? Clementine caught her the hopeful look in her eyes. Maybe later, Jane merely called. Troy shook his head with another dark glare. Sheesh, crap apples. Bonnie snorted with a shake of her head. After herself she took a sip, she passed it along to Mike. Still, I did like that speech, Luke. It's hard to forget the ones we really love left behind, that's for sure. And at those words, Sarah suddenly lit up. Oh, wait a minute, I have an idea. She scurried over to one of the backpacks, digging around and mumbling to herself. Come on, where is it? 1 second. Here we go. After a few moments of shaking, the older girl returned with a bunch of rope in her hands, sitting back down and cracked wide open a nervous grin. What's that for, Sarah? Nick asked. So... The girl began nervously, chewing her bottom lip. Clementine nodded in encouragement with a smile. She bobbed her head in return and continued. When I was a kid, I had a lot of pet fish. I wasn't allowed to have much else, not like a dog or a cat or anything. Unsurprising, Luke commented, rolling his eyes with a soft smirk. I can't see Carlos liking the idea of having a big dog romping around you, Sarah. The girl smiled back sheepishly. I guess that kind of sounds like my dad, doesn't it? But yeah, I only had fish, and they usually don't last long, so we had to keep on getting more. Whenever I lost one, I buried it in my backyard. There was a whole graveyard at one point, with headstones and everything. That's sort of creepy, Clementine joked, imagining a bunch of tiny headstones out in the backyard. They were just like another part of the scenery. Sarah nudged her friend. No, it wasn't. It was cool. My neighbors thought so. At least, eventually they were too many fish graves and really remembered who it was who. Like Fishy was next to Swimmy, but I couldn't figure out where Nemo went. And anyway, I had this one idea one day when I found this rope in my dad's shed. Holding up a piece of rope, she pointed at the ends. I would make each knot for each fish I lost, and I just keep the rope in my room. That way everyone is accounted for, and I had something to hold on to. Luke brightened. Oh yeah, I get it. So you're saying what we should do that now? Yeah, Sarah exclaimed. I mean, if that's okay. I know we have so much of this, but I think it will help. I have been wanting to do it since... Her words trailed off, and she merely shook her head clear. Is it okay? Bonnie nodded. Of course it is. Clem, can you cut pieces for everyone? Sure, how many? Well, there's Kenny, me, you, Bonnie, Luke, Mike, Nick, and I think we should keep some for Jane, Troy, and Arvo too. Sarah nodded to herself, as enough to confirm it. Clementine had raised her trusty hatchet and sliced the long rope pieces, splitting into halves, thirds, and quarters, and so on. She did think it was a good idea, and wished that she had the idea of something like that before, so she could keep her own rope pieces in her pocket for now, to keep Lee and the others close to her. The group around the fire fell silent as they received their slice of rope, gazing down at it and pondering how many knots to make. Clementine did the same thing, only pausing to watch Sarah approach the other three and offer them a piece. She felt overheard Jane mumble her thanks, but Troy had a bit of different reaction. Clutching a small piece of rope in his hand, he threw it a few feet away from him, hissing, I don't want that, Sarah. Doing that, remembering that shit, only slows you down. Don't you all know that? Sarah frowned and stared at her feet, mumbling apologies. Mike called over, Oh, pay him no man mind the kid. I bet he's just pissed that he's got to go into not then to that rope. Troy was practically red in the face from Mike's comment, but Sarah didn't even notice and cautiously approached Arvo. She murmured something to the teen, placing the piece in his hands. Afterwards, she made her way back to the fire and sat down. Clementine then glanced around, knotting the knots that everyone had made. She then looked down at their own rope slice and made 3 knots. For Lee, for her mother and father, though she had lost so many, but they were those most heavy in their coincidence. Her memories constantly ate away at her, taunting her for being alive and for not doing more to save them. Frowning, she heard Sarah begin talking and focusing her attention back to her. Does anyone want to share theirs? I'll go first. Holding out her piece of garland rope, she counted the knots. 1 and 2 from Mom and Dad. I missed them so much. Clementine flashed her friend a sympathetic glance, somewhat of her being proud of being open about things, though. Luke volunteered to go next. I made a few for my folks. For my mom and pop and my aunt. We all lived in the house in the south away from here, together. After the lurkers, shit had just happened and they were gone. I also made 2 for Rebecca and Alvin, so that's 5 for me. Nick placed a hand on his shoulder, giving a gentle squeeze. Quietly, he placed some of his own piece of rope in front of him. 2 knots, once for Mom and Pete. His eyes glazed over with pain, but Clementine could say something different for once. A burning desire to continue to live again, she wondered, what had changed in Nick so suddenly? Pete was a kind man, Bonnie commented, and I'm not just saying that. I've always felt bad for ordering him around. He was so caring. After Nick nodded his thanks, she continued, Anyway, I made one for my mama and pop, who are hopefully watching over me nowadays. And now as for my big brothers, I don't know where they ended up, but I have got a lot of confidence that they're still alive. Strong sons of bitches they were. How about your many brothers did you have? Mike asked. 4 if you can't believe it. I was still their babysitter, though I was never a baby around them. Toughened me up, I suppose. Snickering, she added, and these are the last 2. There was some folks before I ended up in House. I mean, before the group came with Leland and Dee. They were such great people. I can never repay them for what they did to me. Her eyes then reflected with deep regret in them, and Clementine wondered what had happened to them, and how it all went down. Damn, Mike commented, scratching the back of his neck. I made one for my younger sister, who I was separated with before coming into House. I don't think she's dead, at least. I hope to God not, but just in case, and one for my mom. She was a badass woman, fought to both of us to get out of the house when the lurkers attacked. Bonnie gave him another compassion, frowning. Your mama seemed like a strong gal. Amen, Mike snorted, still enough to put in the good mood and the humor in the situation. Clementine liked that about him. He kept things light. If I had died in that herd, I just know she'd be nagging my ear off. Well, the good one. Clementine then smiled slightly, holding up her piece. I made 2 for my parents, who were in Savannah when the whole thing started. And then, of course, my friend Lee. He took care of me and gave his life so I could live. Her stomach churned with uneasiness at the memories, a deep sadness looming over her heart. Just for a moment, she felt herself feel at loss and that sorrow, and then forced it out as best she could. He taught me how to survive. You mentioned him before, Luke murmured. He does seem like a good man, too. Oh, and good, and don't even start describing him, Kenny remarked. Lee was one of my best friends. We may not have agreed all the time, but we were partners at the end. He and Clementine were 2 of the kind. Never saw one without the other. I hope you don't mind, Clem, but I put a knot on my piece for him. And the man closed his eyes from clouded for a second, past overtaking him. And a knot for my wife, Katja, one for my son, Duck, and of course, one for Sarita. He then closed the palm around the object, closing his eyes and thought, May 2 for Walter and Matthew, too. Nick's face drained of the color at those last words, after exchanging a glance with Luke. He then cleared his throat. Kenny, he croaked, I honestly gotta confess something to you, man. Is it really this place, Nick? After we're having a good time talking about loved ones? Luke asked, raising an eyebrow and shaking his head. Clementine tried to relay the same message to the man, but he was persistent as usual. Yes, he insisted. I have to. It's now or never, and I can't take it anymore. Kenny, before we found the cabin, Clem and Luke were talking to Matthew on the bridge. I thought they needed help because they waved to me. I was so frickin' stupid, and His voice began to break as he hung his head low. I shot him right off the bridge. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Clementine held the gaze at Sarah, whose face had painted with her with sympathy. The older girl curled her knees closer to her chest, having a quiet side to herself. No one said a word as Nick's shoulders shook with the tension and guilt, his head lowered over in submission. Kenny's eyes were unreadable. His lips were drawn into a tight frown as he studied the younger man. It was clear that Nick was haunted by this decision, but that didn't mean anything to Kenny, nor did it want him to suffer for what he had done. Finally, Kenny let out a long breath and murmured, Kid, we've all done things we regret. Even if we were doing the right thing at the time. Hell, I once killed an unconscious man who might have lived. And I not smash his face in. I can't say it's okay, but there is no need to torture yourself. I ain't going to lash out. He flashed a gentle smile as he could manage at Nick. I don't think Sarita would have liked it very much. Nick was speechless, his eyes simmering at the unashed tears as he replied, Thank you, Kenny. Kenny nodded, but said nothing once more on the matter, and it clear that he was to finish talking about it. But Clementine knew that it was exactly what Nick needed to hear, and while the while it wasn't something he should be okay with, it was the fact that he killed Matthew was something that he needed to put behind him. It was only dragging him down. Nick's legs bounced up and down nervously as he sat, and Luke patted his knee in comfort. The 2 friends exchanged smiles, and Clementine felt another warm feeling of relief washed over her. Well, I hate to cut this moment short, Kenny announced, suddenly standing up, but I'll go on first watch, I guess. We're pretty secured here with this fence, Mike points out. Can never be too careful. But Clementine was worried for him, yes, but her concern mostly lied with AJ, who was still in Kenny's arms. Did he really need to attempt to deny the infant warmth because of his own obligations? Can you leave AJ with us? Kenny shrugged. Sure, little guy should keep warm anyway. Here, Bonnie. He then offered the child to the redhead, who took him in her arms gently. And now I'm off. Without saying any more, he marched off to a corner, a small fenced-in area, most likely to reflect. Clementine couldn't blame him. as they had been through so much in the icebreaker activity they had just had wasn't helping them take their minds off of things. Not that she thought that it was the best method. Sometimes you needed to all let it out, to keep those you love on your lost in your mind. But there was a time and a place for that sort of reminiscing, and Sarah proposed it was okay. But most of the time now it wasn't. I'm going to see if Arvo needs help with his rope piece, Sarah announced, standing up. She waved to Clementine and without another word made her way over to the bound teen away from the rest of them. Really, Clementine pitied him. It wasn't her decision to tie him up or leave him in the cold. She wished the others couldn't be so cruel. Clem, can you see if those two social butterflies want to join in by the fire? Bonnie's voice snapped out of her thoughts. Maybe try bringing them a bottle and see if persuading them works? The girl nodded, taking the heavy alcohol bottle, approaching Jane first. The young woman seemed in a daze, but her back turned to the group and her arms crossed at her chest, gazing outside of the fence, if there was a ghost or something, or she couldn't quite see. She was then approached, but however, she then turned around and nodded in greeting. Clementine offered the bottle to her, which just made her scoff. They expect you to lure me over there with alcohol? I wouldn't have expected a bottle to last that long, honestly. Jane then nodded, rolled her eyes, though she wore a playful smirk. We just want to get you warm, Clementine replied with a shrug. This is a bonus, though, if you want it. She held it out, and an expectant look on her face. Jane pursed her lips. What is it? Inspecting after the bottle label, Clementine replied, I think it's rum? She didn't know how much about alcohol, but thankfully she could only imagine her father and Lee's faces if they knew what she was doing now. With a quiet laugh, Jane nodded, taking the alcohol without a word and pressing the lip to her mouth. And after taking a gulp, she brought the bottle back down and muttered, Why does this feel like I've signed a contract or something? It's still pretty good. Want a sip? Instantly, Clementine shook her head. No thanks. With the memory of her loved ones so recent, she didn't think they'd approve of the act. It was easier to say no, though she was curious. Jane snorted, her eyes studying the bottle's label absent-mindedly. After reaching into her pocket, she pulled out her own piece of rope from Sarah's activity, one tiny knot into the center. What do you think of that rope thing? I like it, Clementine answered honestly. I think we all need to remember who we lost along the way. Even if we feel nothing about them, Jane questioned, not giving her a chance to reply. My sister Jamie and I mentioned her before, if you remember. She gave up one day, didn't want to get out of bed, even when she said she couldn't do this anymore. And can you really blame her? Bitterly, the woman knitted her eyebrows in frustration. Clementine frowned. It's hard to keep going sometimes. What happens next? I had to drag her ass for the roof of the house we were staying in, and she still refused to move, so I just left her there. Jane crossed her arms, shaking her head. And when I say that, it sounds so weightless, like I'm just talking about the weather or if I ate breakfast. Fuck, I left my sister to die. Even if she was too weak to continue, I don't regret it. Shouldn't I feel something? It was clear that Jane mumbled to herself of the pain of her sister. Either that, or she truly did have Carver's instincts from the start, choosing to let the weak die and rise above them at the end. Clementine really hoped that it wasn't the latter, but she really needed to know Jane. The way she talked about Janie was medical, almost as if like a robot or something. Biting her lip, Clementine didn't really know how to answer that. She did know a lot about this, truthfully. She just knew how she felt about things, and chose what she assumed was right, and what Lee would have done. But without guidance, Jade had to make her own decisions, even if it seemed like the wrong ones after. However, before she could even form a response, a figure approached them, its shadow flickering next to theirs. A familiar voice then broke through this awkward silence, like nails on a chalkboard. The thick southern drawl almost squawking, which was fitting, considering the speaker. What the hell did you just say, Jane? Troy then stepped forward, his face dark with anger. You let your sister to frickin' die? Just willy frickin' nilly? Like she was nothing but old newspaper? What the hell is wrong with you, you bitch? His eyes were fierce, his tone aggressive, and shoved his face into Jane's. The woman didn't take kindly to him being so close. Naturally, she just shoved him back. Watch it, Stumpy. I didn't realize that you were such a good judge of character. Who was Carver's mutt again? What did he promise you in the bone at the moment when you were done mocking the chickens in the pen? In more ways than I assume? Clementine didn't know what she meant by that, but sure it did make Troy mad. The man's lips curled back into like a dog's in his low voice. You just don't get it. Older siblings watch out for the younger ones. Are you stupid? Why would you do something like that? Underneath in all that rage, Clementine could almost detect a bit of hurt or something. There was certainly another emotion there, but she couldn't really tell what it was. Exactly. Whatever it wasn't normal Troy behavior, that was for sure. Troy, what's gone into you? She murmured, reaching forward to grab onto his sleeve. Roughly, he shoved her off. Oh, fuck off, you little shit. We ain't buddies, and there ain't no way I'm staying here any longer than I need to. Good, Jane snapped. You can leave whenever you want, you know, unless you have a bit of an infuriating complex. We need someone to tell you what to do. Well, here, I'll say it again. You can leave, Troy, and don't you ever question my actions again. You weren't there. You can't judge how it feels to have to leave Jamie behind. It don't matter, Troy roared, his fists shaking at his sides and his head lowering to his side by his eyes. I heard what you're saying. You were supposed to be there for her, and you let her down. It was all your frickin' fault. He died. She died. The anger was barely present anymore, replaced with a practically intangible misery that both of them would detect quite easily. Troy, are you? Clementine began to ask if he was all right, but he whipped himself around and shrugged her off, shouting to Sarah. Jane then folded her arms in front of her chest, blinking. I don't know what just happened, she admitted, stupefied. I mean, did I miss something? That wasn't aimed at me, wasn't it? Clementine shook her head. No, it wasn't. I don't know what's wrong with him, besides the obvious. She then forced a little smirk on her face, exchanging with Jane. I'm going to see what he's doing with Sarah, though. Be careful. I don't want him to be your downfall. The woman kicked at the ground and at the tip of her boot, adding quietly, but it looks like he's got some demons of his own slay. Hope he can before they eat him alive. That's everyone's burden, Clementine pointed out. But all we can slay are demons together. Jane chuckled. We could sure as hell try, Clem. I think I'm going to go sit by the fire now. Just being around Troy gives me the chills. She gave a dramatic shiver, huddling herself for effort. At Clementine's surprise, she added quickly, and not the good kind of chills. Trust me. The girl then nodded, giving her another smile. Okay, and Jane, no matter what happened with your sister, you're still welcome in our group. She tried to remain positive after all, as painful as it was, and holding Jane accountable for her actions before they met wasn't fair. After giving a small wave, Clementine turned to see Troy and Sarah standing together a bit away from the group, bottles and guns in hand. She could only assume that Troy was holding his true word and helping Sarah learn how to shoot. Clementine would have to make sure she was present for the lessons, just to be safe. As she made his way over to her, however, she stepped on something and looked at where Troy had been standing. Crouching down, she inspected it. It was the slice of rope that Sarah had given to Troy, she assumed, but it didn't look like the same as before. In the middle, there were a piece of two large, distinct knots.